Do take a seat. Well, some of us are here every week, others maybe not so I thought it would be helpful to explain that something that we as a community do every week is we open up the Bible, very appropriate particularly today given how we're talking about a Bible college, but every week we're in the habit of opening up the Bible to seek to learn from it and also to be changed by it. And people have been doing this with the Bible as we have it for nearly 2,000 years, and with the first chunk of it for at least another 1,000 before that, so we're in good company here. And it shows us things about God, it also shows us things about the world around us, and it shows us things about ourselves as well. It brings life, it brings peace, and also occasionally it brings provocation and challenge to us. We're in the habit of working through patterns, and at the moment the pattern that we're working through is we're reading the very, very first book of the Bible, which, if you're up on your trivia, is called Genesis. It's a book of beginnings, and it's written as a story. So if you have a Bible, do feel free to open it. However, if you don't, I will be reading it out. The book of Genesis it seems initially to be a successive collection of stories about people. But actually, when you look at it, really what it's telling is one long biography of God. And the question is, why is it told as a story? I'm quite a fan of the film The King's Speech. Wave a hand if you've seen The King's Speech. Yeah, quite a few of you. Okay. This is what Wikipedia has to say about that particular kind of period of time. Albert attended Naval College as a teenager and served in the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force during the First World War. In 1920, he was made Duke of York. He married Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1923, and they had 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. In the mid-1920s, he had speech therapy for a stammer, which he learned to manage to some degree. His elder brother ascended the throne as Edward VIII after their father died in 1936, but Edward abdicated later that year to marry the twice-divorced American socialite Wallis Simpson. Albert thereby became the 3rd monarch of the House of Windsor, taking the regnal name George VI. It's all true, but you don't get much of a flavour for the people, do you? And admittedly, the King's Speech is not 100% true. I get it. But by telling that as a story, you get the character, you get the motivation, you get the detail, and it comes to life for you in a way that a paragraph from Wikipedia can never do. And so it is with the book of Genesis. By telling it through the story of God's interaction with people, we get a flavour for what God is like. We see his nature and his character come through each of those stories. So much more than just if we had a textbook version. The story so far, in terms of where we're at the moment, is that Abraham lived with his extended family, as well as a wife and nephews and uncles and so on. And God spoke to him and said, leave your extended family and just you, your little family unit, go to this place that I'll show you, which turns out to be over 1,000 miles away. And he makes him these amazing promises. He says, I will bless you in such a way that other people will be blessed through you. I'll give you children, descendants, too numerous to count. I'll give you a place to be. You'll have significance on a global scale. And where we come to it in this particular juncture, in chapter 15 of Genesis, chapter 18 of Genesis, this is all looking a little bit unlikely. They're still nomadic, so they don't have any land. And so far, Sarah, Abraham's wife, has been childless. And this has obviously caused them to doubt that promise, and they've taken matters into their own hands. And through a process that was generally accepted at the time, but far from ideal, Abraham has had a child by another woman, and things are difficult in their household, and all of this looks really up in the air. So there's these wonderful promises, but at the same time, there's some uncertainty about how are they going to come about, and there's a whole lot of mess in their family unit, and things are, in some ways, not in good shape. And yet, the process so far has been a process of them discovering more and more about what God's like. So, what do we learn from this passage about God? Let's read it, and then we'll see what we can find out about it, about God. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby, and when he saw them, he hurried over from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I found favour in your eyes, my lord, don't pass your servant by, but let a little water be brought for you, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat, so you can be refreshed and then go on your way, now that you've come to your servant." "Very well," they answered, "do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and bake some bread." Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice tender calf and gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them. And while they ate, he stood nearby under a tree. "Where's your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he said. Then the Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already old and well advanced in years, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing, so she laughed to herself as she thought, "After I'm old and worn out, and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I'm old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I didn't laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did laugh." That's where we're pausing today. What do we learn about God from this? Well, in most cultures, views of God fall into one of 3 categories. In some cultures, gods are a bit like humans, but just with superpowers. So they misbehave, they get into arguments and wars, they have affairs, and they interfere with human beings' lives almost for sport. So your Greek legends, those of you who know them, they're always getting up to all kinds of trouble, likewise the Romans. And actually, at the time Abraham was alive in the ancient Near East, that was very much their cultures as well. Their gods of Baal and El were sort of fighting each other and conquering the sea, and there was Marduk and various other characters. And that's one view of God. Another view of God that perhaps is quite common in the Islamic world is that God is distant but powerful. This kind of grandfather with a big white beard, sort of sitting on a cloud somewhere. He's powerful, he's set the world up, and then he stood back and he said, "Yep, I'm going to come and sort it out and judge it one day, but in the meantime, it's over there and I'm over here." And there's a third view which sort of says that God is in everything and flows through everything. There's a sort of a life God force in all of us, and we appreciate it when we see beauty. And you see this come out in Buddhism, but you also see it in the popularity of the Star Wars franchise, don't you? With the Force, which is sort of almost divine, isn't it? And these are 3 really common cultural views of God. But actually, the Christian view of God is quite different, and it comes out really strongly here. Already in God's interactions with Abraham, he's spoken to Abraham. There's been this personal interaction. We don't always realize, or read rather, how it is. Sometimes it's been through a dream or a vision, but sometimes it just says, God said this to Abraham, and we don't quite know how. But there is personal interaction. God is interested in Abraham's life, in Sarah's life, in the life of their descendants, their nephews. Then God is interested in their life. He's involved and he speaks. God is personal. Already we've found that out. But there's something that happens here that is truly amazing. God has just made a promise to Abraham saying, "You're going to be my people and I'm going to be your God, your descendants forever." And it's a bit like, I don't know if you can imagine a Ukrainian refugee coming over and at the border being greeted by, "Here's your British citizenship if you want it. You could be a citizen. You've not earned it or anything. Here's your citizenship if you want it. All the rights, all the privileges, all the duties. It's yours. The Queen will be your Queen. And, this country is your country." It's a bit like that. Now, I would very much like it if that was the case. Perhaps I'm overly simplistic. That would be my heart. But perhaps we could get our heads around what that might look like. But what's really amazing here is that God comes to visit Abraham. This would be like that same refugee having a knock on the door the next day and opening the door, and there they find Queen Elizabeth II on their doorstep saying, You've just arrived. I just wanted to confirm to you what you had promised to you. While you're here, you will be safe, you will be secure. I will personally vouch that you will flourish while you're here in this country. Now that's where it just boggles my mind. It goes out the window. You couldn't possibly imagine that happening. And yet this is what God does. He comes down in person to Abraham and he visits him. So we have these three visitors showing up to Abraham, and we read later on, we're not going to read the whole passage now, we read later on, two of them are said to be angels. The third one he interacts with as God. This is God somehow appearing in human form to him. And God says to him, I'm here. I'm with you. He brings hope. Remember at this stage, Abraham's like, what do I make of all these promises? Because it's all going a little bit pear-shaped. And God brings hope and he brings reassurance. And he brings comfort. How many of us need those things right now? Now, here we are right at the very beginning of the Bible, and it's one incident in one chapter. And we could say, well, look, is this just a one-off? Does this really tell us this is what God's like? But you see, this is not a one-off, because the whole first half of this book, the Old Testament, as we call it, is full of these kind of encounters. God encountering people powerfully. Sometimes he physically is present, sometimes they have dreams or visions, or somebody gives them a message from God. But right throughout the Old Testament, God loves to come to people and meet with them where they are in their situations and speak words of hope and reassurance and comfort to them. But more than that, they also consistently hear God saying, but one day I'm really going to come. One day I'm going to come and be amongst you. And right at the very core of the Bible, that's what we have. Jesus Christ comes to the earth. And he doesn't just come to visit, as this man here visits Abraham. He doesn't just come for a quick chat and then off he goes. But Jesus comes to the earth for 3 decades to show us that he is God with us. Jesus claims to be God. He isn't just a person. He claims to be God. We have 4 eyewitness accounts in the Gospels that show again and again that it's true. Those are some of the best documents we have, if not the best documents we have from that time, in terms of how well preserved they are, how well attested they are. But we also have other sources, historians referring to this Jesus of Nazareth who does miracles. So Jesus shows up, he says, I am God with you. He proves it through the miracles that he performs. And then he says, but I'm here to suffer and die. And sure enough, even though it's beyond his control, he suffers and dies in exactly the way that he predicts. And then he's raised from the dead. And again, that resurrection from the dead is well attested to in 4 eyewitness accounts, plus in all of the things that flowed out of it. His disciples, who were terrified people at the end of his crucifixion, suddenly being filled with power and becoming the founders of this religion that has changed the world. So it isn't just a one-off that God visits Abraham. God comes to people because he is God with us. And he comes to bring hope and reassurance and comfort. And for these 3 decades, he shares the fullness of the human experience. He's born into poverty. He lives as a refugee in Egypt in his childhood. As he grows up, he experiences what it is to be a child and what it is to be an adult. He knows what it is to be hungry and tired. He knows what it is to have friendships, and he knows what it is to be betrayed by a close friend. He experiences torture and death, and then he's raised from death. Jesus truly knows what it is to be like us because he has come to be with us. 6 days ago, there was an update from the Bible Society, and they said we desperately need more Bibles for Ukraine because in the midst of people fleeing from their homes and having to leave so much behind, they were desperate for Bibles. The demand for them has vastly outstripped the supply. And they said, well, if they want it, this is one thing we can give. And they've been trying to source as many Bibles as they can. But why, if you are fleeing from your home because another nation is invading your home, why would you want a Bible? Well, the answer is because it's full of the God who is with us In the midst of all our suffering, in the midst of all our trouble, bringing hope, bringing reassurance, bringing comfort, God meets us in our situations. We like to think, I think, as humankind, that the world is gradually becoming a better place. We're becoming more civilized, we're getting better at resolving conflict, and then something like this situation happens, and we're reminded that actually we're still, in many ways, back where we started. We have a perfect creation, and the thing that hampers it from being perfect is us. It's people like us who are greedy, take more than we need, amplified to a huge scale when we're given large amounts of power, and that greed can take the form of invading another nation or suppressing a minority group. But really, all of us share in the same human condition that really we'd love to be sort of perfect and squeaky clean, but actually our lived reality is we're not, and we fail to live up to our own standards. And so when Jesus comes, he doesn't just come to bring reassurance and hope and comfort, but he also says he comes to rescue us by not just evacuating us to safety, but by changing us on the inside. And a good chunk of the second part of the Bible tells the story of one person for whom that's kind of worked out in front of our eyes. There's a chap called Saul, and he's been very, very well educated. He's sort of well respected in his society, and he's what we would in modern days call a bigot, because there's this group of people who believe this thing that he doesn't agree with, and he goes around rounding them up and arresting them. First of all, he's a witness at a mob execution, and then afterwards, rather than being cut to the heart about the fact that there was this extrajudicial killing and he was a witness there, he sort of throws himself into it. Not only does he go through Jerusalem trying to round up these new Christians, as they're being called, and get them thrown into jail or worse, but he's like, I'm going to go to other places and sort them out as well. And he's on his way to a place called Damascus in Syria, which we know of course, and he has this experience of meeting Jesus, and he is changed on the inside. And the rest of his life, instead of being this well-educated, well-seen of, well-looked upon man, he's treated as the scum of the earth most places he goes. He loses his status. Instead of being proud, he's forced continually to be humble. He changes from persecuting these Christians to serving them right throughout the world. Instead of being the one who perpetrates violence, he's somebody who is willing to undergo violence, to be the victim of violence in order to see people served and blessed, in order to follow Christ. And he changes his name to Paul. And you probably know of the Apostle Paul. That's his backstory. But it's not just then that God changes lives like that. I have a friend who was brought up in Libya. As a teenager, he was radicalized, and he was trained to be a suicide bomber. While he was in a training camp, he had a dream about this man in white who he knew as Isa, which is the word in many Muslim nations for Jesus, who they see as a prophet. He had this dream of Isa al-Masih, who said to him that he would rescue him. After having that dream twice, he managed to escape, and he made his way over to the UK, and eventually found some people who could tell him about this Jesus. He now gives his life to serving those who are homeless, and to seeing people brought out of addictions. Jesus still transforms life today. But you could take anybody who's a regular member of this community, and you could get a story that's perhaps less dramatic but equally powerful. You'd find people who were chronic liars, people who mistreated their spouses, people who were addicted to pornography, people who were constantly afraid and turned in on themselves and full of bitterness and fear. And you could ask them what God had done, and they would say the same thing. God comes to us, he visits us, and he changes us. It's not all worked out in 1 second. He then walks with us and continually changes us as an ongoing process. I said that we look at the Bible to find out more about God and the world around us, but also to find out more about ourselves. And what I see in this story of Abraham and God meeting him, and what I see in the life of Jesus Christ, is that we also have a choice as to what we do. Do we want to be transformed? Do we want to see Jesus Christ and say, There was somebody who lived a perfect life. I wish I was more like him. God, would you change me? When I was 14, I was on a church weekend away, actually. I just went along to the church socially at that point in time because I had friends there. And God stirred something in my heart, and I realised that was what I wanted. I realised that I wasn't happy with being my own leader, my own judge, and making up my own mind about what was right and wrong, and I wanted to follow Jesus. And I wonder if today is that day for anybody else. Jesus says he will come with us, he will be with us, bringing comfort, reassurance, hope, and also rescue from ourselves. I want to encourage you that that offer is open today and every day. Just as it was for me when I was 14, just as it was for my friend, for Saul, as we talked about, and for many, many more people here. I wonder if we could just finish this in prayer. Do feel free to bow your head if you'd like, but don't feel obliged to. A regular part of prayer as Christians is of confession and what we call contrition, saying to God that we're sorry and asking for forgiveness. And it's a prayer that works equally well whether you would call yourself a Christian or not. So I'm just going to pray and say whatever form of these words in your heart you'd like to. God, thank you that you love to draw close to us. We confess that whatever we think of our own lives, God, we fall short of Jesus' perfection. And our falling short is what makes this world a broken place. Jesus, we're sorry for that, and we pray that you would forgive us, please. We invite you to transform us and make us more like you. Amen.